This is video number 3 out of 4 on the sequence of tenses. It's still about time, and we're going to be talking about a truck, an exception to the rule, and some examples. In the earlier videos, we talked about the importance of providing your readers or hearers with a clear sequence, even though the information you're providing may not be given in chronological order. And we talked about using the sequence of tenses to focus on one element or another in the series of events. Now we're going to look at another example that illustrates why you need to know how this works. We'll be sequencing an incident with a truck, the Beltway, and a nap. In the course of your career, you're likely to encounter a number of cases where a situation consists of several events and you're focusing on one of them. That's going to be your point of reference. Everything else is going to happen related to that point, and you're going to use verb forms to signal that relationship. And here is one such. We have 3 events. A trucker falls asleep at the wheel. As a result, his truck, a semi, overturns, and as a result of that, the Beltway is snarled for 3 hours. In presenting this event, a good bit is going to depend on what your focus, your point of reference is. You might have been sent out to report on the accident that overturned the semi. Possibly, you were sent out to report on traffic, and your focus is the Beltway being snarled. Or perhaps your job is to report on the question of truckers falling asleep at the wheel, the issues concerning adequate rest time, and whether, in fact, requirements for adequate rest time are observed. Now, if you start with the trucker falling asleep, if you're looking at issues of whether truckers take adequate rest time, you're going to be looking at this entire situation in chronological order, and we're not going to worry about that because chronological order is easy to do. So we're going to move to number 2 and start with the accident itself. You might write something like this. A semi overturned this afternoon, snarling Beltway traffic for 3 hours. The driver had fallen asleep at the wheel. Notice the past perfect, had fallen. If you don't use the past perfect here, you run the risk of your report sounding like the truck overturned, and while waiting for the repair crew, the driver took a nap. A semi overturned, the driver fell asleep at the wheel. Not really what happened. So the past perfect is the most efficient way to communicate in this case. It sets out your timeline very clearly. Now, possibly you're reporting on the traffic. So now you want to say that the Beltway was snarled for 3 hours. The Beltway being snarled is your point of reference. The semi overturning occurs before that. That's why it's in the past perfect. We need to use the past perfect here, or it sounds like the driver fell asleep, perhaps after the Beltway was snarled. He's sitting there doing nothing, right? And he falls asleep at the wheel. So if you say the Beltway was snarled for 3 hours this afternoon, a semi overturned after the driver fell asleep at the wheel, it can sound like the Beltway was snarled, a driver was sitting there, nothing happening, fell asleep. Perhaps the truck started when he woke up or shifted, or when he woke up and he started to move forward, seeing a space, and had to divert the truck and it overturned. Notice here that we don't overdo the past perfect. You could, of course, say a semi had overturned after the driver had fallen asleep at the wheel, but that's really unnecessary, and frankly, it sounds terrible. Once we have our timeline set, the semi overturns and then the Beltway traffic is snarled, we don't need to say that the driver had fallen asleep at the wheel. The simple past is perfectly good here, especially with the conjunction after. Now, there is one big exception to the rules, and that is when you have a universally true statement. Even if the event that established that universally true fact is in the past, the universal itself is in the present tense because it still applies. In this case, a news report from 2006 says that Australian gastroenterologist Barry Marshall and pathologist Robin Warren were awarded the 2005 Nobel Medicine Prize today for discovering that the bacterium Helicobacter pylori is responsible for stomach inflammation and ulcers. Now, the award happened in the past, even though it was today, but the discovery is presented in the present tense because it is a universal. The action of the bacterium is and remains the cause of ulcers. That's the discovery. You don't get the Nobel Prize for discovering something that is of only limited applicability. And as the report continues, we can see again the use of the present tense to indicate universality. While the idea of a bacteria being present in the stomach has been around for more than 20 years, and I'm just going to pause and notice the present perfect, a past idea coming up to the present, past with present relevance. It has been around for more than 20 years. Much of the medical community believed, past tense, that bacteria could not survive. We'll talk about the use of could as a past tense there, in the stomach's hostile environment. These researchers showed, past tense, that H. pylori survives, present tense, in such an environment and leads to ulcer disease. Okay, let's look at a couple of examples where things don't quite work out. This first one is from an article titled "Bush Threatens Veto Against Bid to Stop Port Deal," and this is George W. Bush. Now, strictly speaking, this sentence is okay, just okay. Here's the situation, and bear in mind this is just a few years after 9/11/2001. There was still, at that point, a lot of suspicion of countries in the Middle East, and basically, in this situation, the United States was contracting out the management of several of its seaports to a corporation based in the United Arab Emirates. This was brought to the attention of Congress, and there was an effort to stop the deal. So here is the description of what Bush said. He's not being directly quoted here. He said the transaction was thoroughly scrutinized by administration officials who concluded that it posed no threat to national security. That's perfectly fine. But it might be more effective with the past perfect emphasizing the completion of the scrutiny. He said the transaction had been thoroughly scrutinized by administration officials who concluded that it posed no threat to national security. That is, a very detailed and specific study was done and completed. And if you were the president's spokesperson, you would want to put that in the past perfect. By the way, it's also possible that posed here, which is in the past tense, could be put in the present tense. Poses no threat to national security because it's still applicable. So it might make a difference if you're presenting this information. You want to emphasize that the scrutiny was completed, and perhaps with the use of the present tense of pose, that it now poses no threat. On to the next one. They noted that some of the hijackers involved in the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks used the United Arab Emirates as an operational and financial hub. Now, this one really does need some work. Here's the problem. Are the hijackers still using the United Arab Emirates as an operational and/or financial hub? Well, no. They're all dead. So really, had used is more accurate here. And here is our last example. I've redacted the student's name. "Life is precious," wrote student, the spring breaker from Ohio who said he would not let a global pandemic stop him from partying. "Don't be arrogant and think you're invincible like myself." This doesn't actually make a lot of sense. He seems to be saying life is precious, but he would still party despite the global pandemic. And then he says, "Don't think you're invincible like myself." So does he think he's invincible and can party, but you shouldn't? Well, you shouldn't, but still. This was published in an article titled 28 University of Texas Spring Breakers Who Flouted Public Health Advice Test Positive for Coronavirus. And it was published on April 1st, 2020. As you can see, the student made comments on two different occasions. He initially said that COVID-19 would stop him from partying. But then he retracted those comments on Instagram on March 22nd. So a past perfect is really needed here to establish a clear timeline and avoid confusion. So here is what you would want to say, and it's the second example here. Life is precious, wrote student, the spring breaker from Ohio, who had said he would not let a global pandemic stop him from partying. Don't be arrogant and think you're invincible like myself. That makes clear that he holds two different opinions at two different times, and that when he is being quoted, life is precious, don't be arrogant and think you're invincible like myself, meaning like I thought I was, that is after his previous statement that despite the global pandemic, he was going to party for spring break. So being aware of the sequence of tenses enables you to present information out of chronological order while keeping the timeline clear for your audience, and also avoid confusing or distracting readers and hearers about the order in which events occur. In the next video, we will talk about could and would.